because such interest simply does not exist. However, the leader had already named the exact amount, which he did not intend to discuss, and was only waiting for the debt to be repaid. It seemed that now there was no point in hiding the truth from the children, because Dorothy tried to keep everything a secret from her loved ones until the very end. One of the guys warned that no one would be able to escape the debt, even if the woman's daughter studied at the Faculty of Cultivation. Suddenly overhearing the conversation, Henry realized that their main boss was the guy in the drugstore who had recently begged him for forgiveness in front of Henry. But the leader didn't know about this yet and thought that it would be easier to smash the shop if the owners didn't want to pay well. However, if Sophia agrees to spend just one night with them and serve them well, he seems willing to pay off her father's debt. The other guys immediately agreed, and the leader slowly walked straight towards the frightened, unfortunate girl. It seems that these guys were looking for death, since they dared to come to the house of the best alchemist in the city and cause a pogrom. Realizing that Henry was seriously eager to fight, Sophia immediately stopped him, warning him that some of the guys were strong and it could be dangerous. The gang leader was ready to crush Henry like a bug and warned that nothing would happen to him for the murder. But it was unlikely that this could frighten Henry, because in his past life he had met rivals more serious than this idiot. However, the girl was so worried about him that Henry decided not to rush and not to get into a fight for now. He needed to act with more restraint and find another way to get rid of these hooligans. And then, turning to the chief of them, Henry asked how much his father had managed to owe them. Realizing that the big guy didn't believe him, Henry assured him that he wasn't going to run away and was willing to pay to solve the problem once and for all. But instead of simply paying, he unexpectedly called the person who was used to resolving such issues. Seeing a call from an important guest, Ralph immediately ordered everyone to be quiet and let him talk on the phone in peace. The elixir, the recipe for which Henry had recently given him, worked better than the others, and the man was grateful to him for his help. But now Henry himself needed help, as he was being attacked by a crowd of hooligans who were extorting money from his family. Moreover, the leader stated that now they owed not 200,000, but 400, because the interest was growing with every minute. Hearing this exorbitant sum, Dorothy objected. Because they only borrowed 50,000, where did such interest come from? But the guy insisted that they had to pay exactly what he said, and not 1,000 less. Ralph was listening to this entire conversation on the other end of the line, and he immediately recognized the voice of the gang leader, who could hear well. Realizing the seriousness of the matter, he asked the guy not to worry and said that he knew these people very well. And then, immediately ordering his fighters to follow him, he was ready to go straight to where the local hooligans were causing mayhem. Moreover, their victim was a man for whom Ralph was now ready to get up even in the middle of the night and go wherever Henry told him to. But Dorothy couldn't figure out who this friend was that Henry was talking to and why he agreed to lend her so much money. However, this did not bother the leader of the hooligans, who was waiting for retribution and was glad that Henry quickly found a man with money. But the worst thing was that he was going to take Sophia by force later, even if the mother and this smart boy paid off all the debts. At that moment, a black-tinted car with Ralph sitting in it pulled up to their small store. He brought so many guards that their cars barely fit in the parking lot next to him. And it was clear that Ralph had made serious preparations. He walked loudly into the store, and turning around at once, everyone realized that these guys would soon have to receive not money, but something less pleasant, but generous to give away. After all, this was the very man they feared more than anything in the world, and with whom they would never want to get involved. But it was too late, because they dared to disturb the young student to whom Ralph owed a lot, and therefore became his personal enemies. Looking the bastard straight in the eye, Ralph told him to get out of the way and promised to deal with him later. Of course, he heard the name of the scoundrel, but now he was more concerned about the condition of his new young friend. Henry immediately asked not to give him away, and to speak more quietly so that no one would find out who he really was. Luckily, Henry and his family were okay, but those guys still deserved a good beating, which is what he wanted to ask for. Pointing to the main bully and his accomplices, the guy asked that in a few minutes all these freaks' arms be broken. In response, Ralph simply glanced at the main idiot in this gang and was ready to fulfill the request without delay. Of course, he tried to justify himself, saying that there was a misunderstanding and he could explain everything. But it was too late to explain anything, and Henry only asked not to break anything in his parents' store. Ralph assured that everything would remain intact, except for the faces of those guys, who would be a little battered. And then he hit the leader with such force right in the jaw that he almost lost consciousness and flew far to the side. The two guys who came with him also deserved punishment, and agents from Ralph's personal security rushed to deal with them. Yes, of course, the scene was unpleasant. But Dorothy understood that these people had done a lot of harm, and there was no reason to give them a reason to return. The guy said with a smile that from that day on, everything would be fine, and none of those bastards would dare to bother his good friend's mother anymore. But what now concerned Sophia most was how Henry had managed to get close to such an influential man as Ralph and secure his patronage. In response, Henry quickly came up with a story that he and Ralph had met by chance and had become friends almost immediately. Taking the hint, Ralph immediately confirmed his words and once again assured him that he would not allow a bunch of freaks to get on the nerves of his loved ones. But in any case, beating them half to death was already too much, and the poor woman was seriously worried whether they would remain alive. The man immediately explained that for these people, a broken arm was no worse than a scratch, because they had fought so often that they had long since gotten used to it. However, it was clear from their appearance that it wasn't every day that these guys got such a beating, and it was unlikely that any of them would have gotten any real pleasure from it. After this, Ralph asked how else he could help his young friend, since the issue with the three scoundrels was completely closed. It seemed that now they were not as bold as a couple of minutes ago, and no one demanded 400,000 from Henry's sick father. With difficulty speaking, the beaten leader assured that they would write off all the debts, since he did not know about Henry's friendship with their boss. After listening to him, Henry nevertheless accepted the offer and said that he too did not expect to see Ralph's subordinates among his enemies. However, it was this big guy who had been bullying his family, so Henry wanted to say a few warm words to him as he said goodbye. It was clear from his look that he wasn't going to just leave it like that, and that broken arms alone wouldn't be enough. The matter was more serious than he thought, and the bully tried once again to explain that he was no longer dangerous, and there was no need to beat him even harder. But Henry had no intention of doing this, and merely gave him a good scare by warning him that their next visit to his mother's shop would be their last walk in life. And then he just watched as the three guys ran as fast as they could towards the exit, happy to be alive. At that moment he remembered that he had prepared a remedy that would very quickly get his father back on his feet. Henry explained that it was Ralph who helped prepare the medicine, which, if taken, would immediately make his father well and forget about his illness. He explained that he had to take out a loan to buy the ingredients, but promised to pay off the entire amount soon. Of course, Dorothy was overjoyed and couldn't hold back her tears, promising to help Henry pay off the loan. And then the guy suddenly realized that Sophia began to look at him in some special way, and could not understand the reason for her intent gaze. And she suddenly admitted that Henry's look seemed different to her, and she realized that the guy had quickly matured and grown up. In response, he made another dirty joke about how the girl didn't even realize how much he had matured in recent times. Soon after, Henry was back in his room, happy that the problem of his father's illness was solved. The medicine was created using the alchemy of the immortal spirit, and the boy understood that he could not rely on it alone forever. He then instantly plunged into the dimension where the Hall of Heroic Souls was, wanting to see how both soul pillars had changed. It turned out that, having absorbed the fear and greed of those three, the pillars shone brighter, which meant that the appearance of the next spirit was just around the corner. But Henry's strength already surpassed that of all the first years combined, and it was unclear why he needed another assistant. However, his real enemies, with whom he would soon have to fight, were much stronger than all these kids. After all, exactly 1 month later, an event would occur that would put an end to his past life and the lives of many of his loved ones. The Black Dragon of the Springs had already appeared on Earth once before, and was one of those nightmares that still haunted him in his dreams. Henry remembered very well how that brutal battle went, and how many lives were taken by the main battle between people and monsters. That day, a giant monster, just like the aliens, unexpectedly appeared on the side of the people and fought bravely to the end. While the dragon held the giant's body like a snake, the other magicians aimed at the main alien's vulnerable spot to strike. The master, who had power over the element of water, created a charge of energy in a lashing wave, hoping to at least temporarily immobilize the monster. A whirlpool swirled around the master, and the entire mass of water rushed towards the giant to knock him off his feet. Seconds later, a funnel of water closed around the giant, and he quickly sank into its center, leaving only a huge paw on the surface. This was their last chance, and the magicians below asked the girl not to delay her blow. Realizing that there would be no other chance, Julia called upon the lightning from the heavens to become a divine sword and strike the monster. The power hit the monster in one destructive stream, and was supposed to not only neutralize it, but also destroy it forever. And then there was a loud roar, and stones rose up from under the ground, as if something had burst from the very core of the planet. Even a joint attack by the best magicians did not help, and none of them managed to break through the alien's defense. But now, it seems, the monster has decided to make a move and, seeing the master, unleashed a wave of destructive force on him. The master could only watch as death rapidly approached, and he understood that today he would meet his end. He no longer had time to use protective magic, and in the last seconds of his life, he realized that he had done everything possible. As soon as the wave touched the man, his body instantly split into pieces, and it became clear that the monster was stronger than they thought. Yes, his magic could destroy the planet, but he still stood there as if he hadn't noticed the attack of experienced masters. All these little people below seemed to the giant like commoners who didn't know what real destructive magic was. And then the guy suddenly opened his eyes and realized that he couldn't immerse himself in visions of the past for so long, because they were increasingly pulling his consciousness in. He couldn't understand whether there would be a chance of winning the fight in a month if he called on another spirit for help. Perhaps the immortal spirit himself knows another way to deal with the giant, and the guy would be glad to learn about it as soon as possible. Out of habit, the spirit launched into a long story about the creation of the planet, but Henry angrily interrupted him, asking him to get to the point. Then the spirit immediately went on to tell the story of how the creature was born, burning everything in its path and reaching Henry in a past life. From the conversation, the guy realized that the monster had previously been different, and expelled from the kingdom of heaven, became a fallen angel thirsting for revenge. The immortal spirit reminded that when the monster was born, it was not an ugly giant, but a holy spirit, like the other celestials. But after the expulsion, all the demons were born from the flesh of this former celestial being, and therefore gained abnormal power and eternal life. In their eyes, the human race was considered only an inferior species until many people developed magical abilities. There were only 3 methods of dealing with these aliens, which Henry had to learn about right now. First, you need to find a sacred artifact that is strong enough to pierce the bodies of these monsters. Secondly, Henry needs to summon as many souls of great celestials as possible, combining their experience with his skills. Finally, Henry's combat power must reach 1,000 ranks, which means he must quickly attain the 9th level of enlightenment. But it is impossible to do all this in a month, especially since the pursuers from the academy simply will not give him time for this. Although the guy understood that it would be easier to deal with Charlie and his people than with the giant, and was ready to take on this sooner. Moreover, his technique of primordial chaos became better every day, and his experience in using it grew with each training session. Besides, the negative emotions of these people served as excellent fuel for the soul pillars, so he was looking forward to meeting Charlie. Once in the room, the boy began to meditate as usual, and the immortal spirit watched, not understanding whose reincarnation this young man was. After all, his strength grew so rapidly, as if he was not an ordinary person, but one of those celestials worshipped by the immortal spirit himself. The next day, there were morning classes at the academy, but Henry's thoughts were far from being about his studies. Thinking about the mutant invasion, he realized that cultivation through meditation alone was too slow, and real battles were needed to grow quickly. While wondering who he could have such a fight with, he saw in front of him someone who would not refuse a duel himself. Just recently, Jimmy learned that Charlie paid a lot of money to a dangerous hooligan to find Henry and kill him. Anyone else would probably not have been pleased by this news, but the guy replied with a smile that this was exactly what he had been waiting for. Not sharing his amusement, Jimmy reminded him that this was no joke and the guys had already gathered to distract Sophia and be alone with Henry. Not understanding his friend's strange reaction, Jimmy was still glad that Henry accepted challenges so easily and was not afraid of them. They were chatting so loudly that the teacher couldn't stand it and threw a small piece of chalk towards the boys. The chalk hit Henry right in the face, because there was no other way to distract the student from his uncontrollable chatter. Besides, Michelle had already asked him a question about the topic of the lesson and wanted to get a clear answer to it. Charlie's friends immediately made a couple of sharp jokes, saying that the class's biggest idiot had had bad luck again. But to their surprise, the boy suddenly jumped up from his seat and gave a full answer to the teacher's question. He knew the history of ancient empires very well, not from books, but because he himself lived at that time, before his rebirth. And then, having finished his answer, he suddenly asked the teacher if she herself knew all the facts that he had just given. For the first time in her life, Michelle simply couldn't find an answer, because the student's information was truly unique. However, Henry cared little about the theory, because he was interested in how the Empress was currently living, and whether she needed any help. Yes, this guy easily grasped the essence of the subjects and was even forgiven for this constant stupid behavior. Deciding that this was Henry's last moment of glory, Charlie prepared himself for his boys to disfigure him, because he had already paid a decent amount for it. It's a good thing Henry knew about the attack, because it was precisely this crowd of hooligans that he had been looking for all this time. On the same day, in addition to theory, there were two pairs of physical education classes, which usually took place in the fresh air. Julia, who was currently leading the class, asked everyone to move freely and not get injured during the exercises. But the girl did not understand why cultivators needed sports at all and how it could help in the fight against mutants. At this point, Sophia invited her friend to play tennis with them so that he wouldn't sit alone on the sidelines. However, her friend still considered Henry a bad person, and all these rumors about his dirty plans were true. Moreover, he again made a dirty joke about how he liked to watch from the sidelines two beautiful girls playing with balls. Realizing that he couldn't be moved, the students began to play a game of tennis, especially since the weather was excellent. It was obvious that this was not the first time they had held rackets, and from the outside it seemed as if they were masters of this sport. Having made another great strike, Sophia watched as her friend again failed to block it. Jimmy was delighted at how easily they made difficult shots, but Henry continued to look at the balls, not at the tennis itself. It was unclear what was amusing him so much and why he kept his eyes on one of the girls even when the ball was at the other end of the court. Of course, the main object of his observation was Sophia. She behaved so casually, as if she had played tennis all her life. However, her friend Chloe also played tennis quite confidently and looked good next to her classmate. Realizing that his friend was not interested in sports at all, Jimmy asked him to at least not look at the girls so intently and not attract unnecessary attention. But then their classes were interrupted by a man who liked other competitions and preferred fights without rules. It was a freshman named John who had come here to look into the face of the man who had dared to raise a hand against Charlie. John grabbed him by the shoulder, but Henry didn't even turn around and demanded that he not interfere with his enjoyment of the game. Jimmy immediately recognized him as one of the three leaders of the Academy's strongest club, a formidable opponent for any student. Realizing that he had to speak more harshly with this guy, John smashed the bench where Henry had just been sitting to pieces with one blow. Henry immediately understood on whose behalf John had come and what goal he was pursuing now. But since the guy was looking for trouble, Henry was ready to give him some, especially since he distracted him from an interesting spectacle. The girls noticed from afar that something was wrong in the stands, but they did not understand who started this conflict. Yes, these were the same bandits obsessed with street fights, and Chloe understood how this argument would end. It was unclear why the guys were specifically going after Henry, and Sophia decided to immediately go up to him and find out for herself. But then Vincent jumped onto the court and immediately swung his giant fist at her. Chloe was the last person she expected to see here, was this formidable fighter, and shouted at her friend to stay away from him. But he appeared too suddenly, and only at the last moment did Sophia manage to put up a block, gathering a little protective energy. From such a direct blow, Sophia flew to the side, and blood immediately gushed from the wound on her arm. Sophia's power had already reached rank 8 during her time at the academy, but it was useless to fight such a strong fighter. This second-year student, who looked like a grown man, was 2 places higher than her in the rankings, and his power rank was also higher. The attack was too sudden, and it was good that she managed to avoid hitting the important points, although Sophia's left arm was broken. The worst part was that the fracture was open, and Chloe herself saw how blood continued to gush out of Sophia's wound. Looking at this psychopath, Chloe asked him at the last moment not to do anything stupid and stop. This was no longer just a student disagreement, because the other side had a hand in the attack, and Charlie was involved. Besides, Henry was also in danger, and a crowd of athletes had already gathered around him, ready to fight. But there was no time to worry about others, because that thug had already attacked Sophia again.